Hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. You know, revolutions are happening all over the world. The big question is, what about the United States of America? When's it going to start revolting? I know it's already revolting, but when's it going to really revolt? Stacy Herbert, what's happening?
The first war we're going to talk about is the economic war. Paul B. Farrell, forget Mubarak, it's Fed reign of terror that must end. Now this is your take with a very pretty picture on Paul B. Farrell's headline, Fed dictator Bernanke needs to be toppled. So he says that the Fed boss, Ben Bernanke, is the most dangerous human on earth, far more dangerous than Hosni Mubarak, Egypt's 30-year dictator, ever was. Bernanke rules a monetary dictatorship that will trigger the coming third meltdown of the 21st century.
Right. You know, a year ago or so, Paul B. Farrell over there at MarketWatch, Dow Jones, might have been accused of sedition. But because the global insurrection against banker occupation is gathering force all over the world, the forces that are in power now can't stop it. The momentum is too high. So we're seeing Egypt, we're seeing Tunisia, we're seeing riots all over the world. In America, it's coming soon, and it's time for a regime change. And he's right to target the Federal Reserve Bank because Obama, let's face it, Obama is just a sideshow. The real power is Ben Bernanke and the Federal Reserve Bank. That's where the regime change needs to take place.
And Ben Bernanke is the figurehead for a collection of private banks and a few corporations like Chevron who own the Fed. And they are the ones that are profiting from this economic war, as Paul B. Farrell talks about it. He lists 10 reasons for weapons of this financial warfare that perpetrated by the Fed. And I'll list you 3 of them. Commodity price inflation will soon end the Fed dictatorship. Next, near zero rates means banks richer, masses poor, meltdown. And then finally, easy money fueling worldwide inflation and a new meltdown. So as you've mentioned, we've seen this in commodity price inflation all over the world.
Well, as you point out, the Federal Reserve Bank is owned by banks and corporations. It's a private corporation. It's not a function of the United States government in any way. It's there as a lobbying group for corporations. The number 2 you mentioned, near 0% interest rates. This is really the killer because in the United States and around the world, interest rates are not allowed to trade per the market. They're kept artificially low to give free money to the speculators. Whenever they make a losing bet, then the government bails them out. And to pay for the government's bailout, they put a gun to the people's head through austerity measures. We're seeing it in Greece. We're seeing it in Ireland. They put a gun to the people's head with austerity measures to bail out the banks who were holding the government hostage. So this is just easy money fueling worldwide inflation. Yes, they're getting greedy. They're forcing prices to go up to astronomical price levels. I read a statistic somewhere on the number of people actually forced into poverty.
Well, that's our next headline,
Max
Keiser.
This is really fantastic. So continue on and get into the nitty-gritty.
World Bank warns of soaring food price dangers. So apparently, in the last year, an estimated 44 million people have been pushed into poverty since last summer by soaring commodity prices. Robert Zoellick, the World Bank president, said food prices have risen by almost 30% in the past year. Wheat has doubled. Maize is up 73%. So this is what you're seeing going on in the world.
Right, and this is caused from primarily the Federal Reserve Bank is increasing the supply of cheap fiat money. The demand for the food is not the problem. It's the supply of credit that's giving speculators an easy way to make greedy bucks in the short term, even though it's putting 44 million people on the starvation lines. So, I mean, think about the number of people who died in World War II, people who died in previous wars. This is of that comparable size. The Federal Reserve is actually putting tens of millions of people into a grave.
Well, that's 44 million people, yes, that they're causing to starve, which is why Paul B. Farrell says that Ben Bernanke is more dangerous than Mubarak. Remember, Mubarak was a front man just for the military-industrial complex. Ben Bernanke operates on behalf of the financial-industrial complex.
That's right. So there's going to need to be a regime change at some point as a matter of survival. You know, people in America debate whether it's a left-wing issue or a right-wing issue. It's not left or right. It's a matter of survival. Either you get rid of Bernanke or you die.
But the situation, Max, we got rid of Mubarak, but who's going to be put in there by the military-industrial complex but another dictator? That's what will happen. The same thing, you can get rid of Ben Bernanke. He is a financial dictator, but the guys behind him are still there, and they'll put in another guy who might be a little bit more pleasant. Jamie Dimon, a little bit better looking than Ben Bernanke. Perhaps he'll be it.
Well, that's why I say everyone in the world should buy silver bullion, because that's the underbelly sore spot, the vulnerability of these banks. You mentioned Jamie Dimon. JP Morgan's vulnerability is their short silver position. So the wealth that all these banks stole using the Fed to bring that wealth back home, buy silver, you have the double effect of becoming wealthy yourself while putting these banks out of business by driving their stock price to zero. So you're right, there will be more dictators behind the current dictators, more CIA operatives behind the current CIA operatives. That's why you've got to go for the global insurrection against banker occupation. Buy silver, put them all out of business.
A lot of people will say, oh, you can't possibly touch JP Morgan because they are the Fed, they are the government. But this next headline and this next bit of information we have here shows you that you can scare them. Food price follies, the grown-ups step in. Now, this is the reformed broker Joshua Brown talking about an announcement from Deutsche Bank, a crucial bank to this global banking cartel, very crucial in the creation of derivatives. Now, they have suspended further issuance of the PowerShares DB Agriculture Double Long Exchange Traded Note. It trades on the New York Stock Exchange under the symbol DAG. Apparently, industry sources believe that exposure the ATN was holding to corn, wheat, soybeans, and sugar futures was nearing limits that might attract the attention of regulators at the Commodity Futures Trading Commission.
That's right. One way to keep the lid on the speculators running amok are position limits and margin requirements. If you remember, at the end of last year, silver was getting through 30, and then the CFTC under former Goldman Sachs guy Gary Gensler and his crew simply expanded the position limits and expanded the margin requirements, or reduced the margin requirements. And in such a way, they allowed for more of the criminals, the criminal banking elite, to manipulate these prices even more. But, you know, there are hundreds of millions of us. There's only a few of them. Price of silver is going to $500 an ounce, and that will pretty much take care of JP Morgan.
But going back to these agricultural products, Joshua Brown ends with the torches and pitchforks may have been put into cold storage as the economy rebounded, but trust me, the villagers know where they left them. So he's saying that Deutsche Bank was right to put away this double long, like highly leveraged exchange traded note, which would help drive up the price of already high commodities, agricultural products.
Well, everything on the margins in the commodities business is being examined by the speculators and the governments who are beholden to the people, because the governments, even in Germany, Merkel doesn't want to have to deal with a revolt in Germany because she allowed for the special products to engineer speculative excesses by the worst financial criminal among us, the terrorists. So she's looking after her own interests. At some point, you really have to decide, do you want to survive and go on servicing the needs of the speculators at risk of having a revolution in your country? And that's what it's come to now in this year.
Now back to the U.S., the other duopoly part of this financial war is the military war, the military-industrial complex. And a lot of great unmentioned in this global financial catastrophe we've seen is the role of the unfunded U.S. wars around the world. They are being funded. It's through money printing and instability in the financial system. Now, here's a little video of Jeffrey Sachs, who is a professor at Harvard and also a UN advisor. And here's his take on Obama's new budget.
And we're turning around and we're just going to keep driving down the poorest of the poorest of the poor. And that's where we are. This is a game that's going to come to an end in a bad way. Do we really have to have our own Egypt here in the United States? Or are we going to actually understand that we have a society where half the people have no voice in this country at all?
Yeah, remarkable. You know, Obama basically is cutting money, stealing money from the poor to give to the rich. He's the reverse Robin Hood.
That's correct. And as a percentage of the budget now, the military, the Pentagon budget has gone up. And actually I have a chart here. You can see where the $3.6 trillion of Obama's budget goes. Along the bottom, that's defense. and Social Security, the two major components of the budget. And you could also add in the veteran benefits of $124 billion, and then Medicare at $462 billion. That in total, so just the Pentagon and the budget for retirees is over $2 trillion of the $3.6 trillion. Whether or not the pitchforks are going to come out, you see in this new Gallup poll, Americans divided on defense spending. So overall, 39% of Americans, according to the latest Gallup poll, say the U.S. spends too much on defense. 22% say it spends too little, and 35% say defense spending is just fine. Here's another chart if you look at the partisan divide. A full 40% of Republicans say too little is spent on military, and 9% of Democrats say the same thing. And yet, look back at that chart, you see from the $3.6 trillion in government expenditure, almost half of it is from just military spend. And yet, this is not welfare, this is not corporate welfare.
Well, that's exactly the point that should be made. If the question was, do you support welfare for psychopaths in the industrial military contracting business, most people would say no. But you call it defense, and it gets confusing. Of course, the fact is, Stacy, that if the interest of these dollars being spent on military hardware is to defend the homeland and to proffer some security, I suggest America stop invading countries and killing people and inviting retribution, like we saw in 9/11.
But the important thing to look at here is we talked about the economic war, and a lot of money went missing in these offshore vehicles, in these fake derivatives. And the same thing is happening here with this fake war. It's kind of a fake war in Afghanistan and Iraq because, I mean, a lot of people were killed and bombs were dropped, but billions and billions and billions constantly go missing. There are constant government oversight reports saying, well, we lost $10 billion this month. We don't know what happened to all that cash. It's gone. The same thing. So it's just money going to total welfare queens that are just pocketing the money, taking it out via Dubai, transferring it back into the U.S. in suitcases.
Yeah, and what substitutes for American military these days are crack-addled kids in Florida playing video games attached to howitzers and machine guns, flying Predator drones in Pakistan, blowing up civilians for a milkshake in bonus.
And then finally, bringing it back, the military-industrial complex meets the financial-industrial complex. This OMB chart shows how the financial crisis ruined America's debt outlook. So the reason why Barack Obama is slashing $1.1 trillion in spending on poor people is because the media pays a lot of attention to what poor people receive. And even though it's a tiny, 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 tiny percentage of the overall U.S. budget, this chart shows their 6-year budget projections. And as you can tell, from 2008, it totally went ballistic because the financial crisis happened then. So because of the financial crisis, because of the banking crimes, the difference now is 49% gap between where the deficit would have been and where it is now.
All right, Stacy Herbert, thanks again for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
Now when I come back, I'll be speaking with William D. Hartung, who wrote a book, Profits of War, much about the military-industrial complex, so don't go away. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. Time now to go to New York. Talk with William Hartung, author of Profits of War. William is also the director of the Arms and Securities Initiative at the New American Foundation. William, welcome to the Keiser Report.
Thanks for having me.
All right, William, throughout the coverage of the Egyptian Revolution, over and over again, we see reference to a $1.3 billion given annually by the U.S. to the Egyptian army. Where does this money actually go?
Well, it's sort of recycled. It briefly stops in Egypt, but basically it comes back to major contractors in the U.S. like Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, General Electric, Raytheon for fighter aircraft, tanks, missiles, a whole range of, essentially the entire Egyptian armed forces have been outfitted by the United States going back to the beginning of the Mubarak regime 30 years ago.
Right, and this is a model that the U.S. uses in other countries as well, correct?
Yes, some countries through aid in places like Yemen, others, Saudi Arabia purchases weapons from the United States. So there was a recent deal for $60 billion, the largest arms deal ever concluded for combat aircraft, attack helicopters, bombs, guns. It was a huge package including a full range of military systems.
So America's push for democracy in the region is coupled with America's arms dealing in the region. And in fact, it's America's arms dealing welfare recipients in the region who are, I guess, ostensibly pushing for something called democracy, but as long as they get this welfare associated with it. Meanwhile, the people on the ground have had enough and they revolted. So what's going to happen now going forward, now that there's been this populist revolution in Egypt, for example, Tunisia? Is this going to cut into this Pentagon welfare scheme?
I think it's going to be an open question what happens with the arms deals and the military aid. Certainly, if democracy takes root, there are other needs in these countries, supporting agriculture, education. One of the roots of the uprising had to do with the fact that people couldn't get decent jobs, even fairly well-educated people. So in an ideal world, some of that would be reinvested in civilian activities. But the military in Egypt is still controlling the transition. They've got long-standing ties to the United States military and the Pentagon. So I think it's really an open question as to what will happen as a new government comes together.
All right, so in the book Profits of War, your book, you focus a lot on Lockheed Martin. Are they the biggest recipient of this corporate welfare, and what are the numbers? How much?
Well, Lockheed Martin certainly is the biggest recipient of Pentagon contracts, both from the Pentagon itself and through foreign sales as to Egypt. $29 billion a year, the biggest recipient of U.S. tax dollars, and the largest weapons contractor in the history of military-industrial complex.
Right, so now these numbers are not included in the official Pentagon budget, right? I mean, that's a separate line item. And so this is just gravy on top of the largesse of the taxpayer to lard the coffers of these defense contractors. It's just more money for them, right?
A lot of the military aid is funneled through the Pentagon in the sense that the Pentagon serves almost as an arms broker. They've got a whole separate department called the Defense Security Cooperation Agency, which sounds sort of benign, but it's really kind of an in-house weapons trafficking operation. And so you've got that in the Pentagon rubric, but you've also got things like nuclear weapons design, which happens through the Department of Energy. You've got a whole range of biometric and surveillance technology through the Homeland Security Department and the FBI. So you've got a whole range of agencies, spy satellites for the National Security Agency, outsourcing of CIA activities. So it's more than just that $29 billion for the Pentagon.
It seems that a lot of the technologies that go into surveillance and these other areas, they debut, if you will, off-Broadway in these foreign countries. And then they end up in the U.S. For example, Predator drones, we heard about them first in Pakistan, and then we saw them in Texas, looking at the border between Texas and Mexico. Is this part of the strategy of a way to kind of beta test a lot of these technologies in foreign countries before they bring them into the U.S.?
I think it's sort of inevitable, just in the sense that in a conflict like Afghanistan, the predators have been viewed as a way to, quote-unquote, limit civilian casualties, to go directly after leaders of the Taliban and al-Qaeda. So they saw an application there, and of course these were armed with Hellfire missiles, which are another Lockheed Martin product. But then the surveillance aspects, as you said, have been applied on places like the U.S.-Mexico border. So I think it's not clear why it happens that way, except that, of course, the systems have much more direct usage in some of these overseas conflicts. So in a sense, they are given their test run. I don't know if that's on purpose, but it's certainly what ends up happening.
All right, just to review on this budget matter, because Obama just released his budget for the year, record deficits for the U.S., the Pentagon gets a huge piece of it. Martin Marietta, they're part of the $722 billion Pentagon budget, and this is, according to your work, does it add or subtract? Let me just ask you a bit of a more philosophical question, but the overall U.S. economy as a whole, if more than half of it is to fund these arms dealers in countries where they're failing to the extent that the local population has to stage their own uprising, Is this any good for the U.S. economy at all? Does it do anything for defense? Does it do anything for democracy? Does it do anything for the economy? Does it succeed on any level?
In terms of the economy, it's a smaller percentage than you might think. Probably about 4 or 5% of the GDP is for military spending. A lot of that, it's strategically located in places like Ohio, where Speaker of the House John Boehner is, in California, where the head of the Armed Services Committee, Buck McKeon, is, in Hawaii, where Daniel Inouye, the head of the Appropriations Committee in the Senate, is. So it exerts an influence larger than its economic weight. And what that means when they try to, for example, cancel a system like the F-22 fighter plane, as was done, they have to almost give a payback to the company. What they did was they cut the F-22 by $4 billion. They added $4 billion to the F-35 and other Lockheed Martin products. So they basically kept the jobs base satisfied and the contractor base satisfied in the regions where the members were most concerned. But as a result, the military budget did not go down. I think in terms of foreign policy, a lot of these sales, particularly to undemocratic regimes, don't serve the long-term interests of the United States. I think there was a good piece in AOL.com about what would have happened if those billions and billions spent on weapons had been spent on supporting schools, supporting food programs, supporting the civilian economy in Egypt. Might there have been a more seamless or even a sooner transition to a genuine democratic system? So I think certainly there's overspending now compared to what would be needed for strict defensive purposes. And in that sense, those extra dollars beyond what's needed to defend the country, I think, are not only a waste, but in some cases they're counterproductive in terms of the defense of the country. So, I think certainly some Pentagon spending is needed, but we're probably, $100 billion or more above what would be needed for strict defensive purposes, and a lot of that goes to feed the military-industrial complex.
Of the dollar, let's say a dollar. If I put $1 in taxes last year to the U.S. government, what percentage of that goes to military budget?
The military is more than half of the discretionary budget, which is the part that doesn't count Social Security and Medicare. So Social Security and Medicare have their own taxes. So in terms of regular tax dollars, probably more than half of them, go for military purposes.
Okay, so let's say, for the sake of argument, 50% of the tax dollars goes into the military-industrial complex, which we have just decided it does not return much in terms of a cost-benefit analysis. Now, you mentioned that the total industry is 4% of, or 4 to 5% of America's GDP. But we know that 80 to 85% of America's GDP is fueled entirely by debt that has been created at the behest of Wall Street bankers to generate fees for themselves. It has nothing to do with the real economy. The actual real economy in America is shrinking, jobs are crashing, infrastructure is crumbling. The actual economy of America, strip away the debt, is considerably smaller. So it's a bit misleading to say that it's only 4 or 5% of GDP, because GDP in America is completely fallacious. It's entirely debt-driven by, the equivalent of the Taliban on Wall Street, the financial terrorists at Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan. I think more pertinent, more to the point, is that 50 cents every tax dollar goes to programs that are failing on any way you look at it. Now, Ron Paul, who's a contender for president, presumably coming up in the next election, he thinks that it's possible to shut down most of the military bases around the world and shut down a lot of the military-industrial complex. Is that a good way to go, in your opinion?
I think certainly there's overstretch in terms of overseas presence. By different measures, there's somewhere between 700 and over 1,000 military bases around the world. I think a lot of those could be reeled back. They make it easier to intervene in various places, but it's not clear that we want to be able to do that on short notice. I think we could use a little more thought and deliberation before we go into wars of occupation, as happened in Iraq, for example, which was facilitated by U.S. access to military bases in the Persian Gulf.
During the Iraq skirmish, war, invasion, incursion, takeover, whatever you want to call it, there was that story floating around that pallets of money arrived and disappeared, billions of dollars. If you recall the story, whatever happened to that money? Did they find the money? Did it go up somebody's nose? What happened to it?
There was a period where some of the smaller contractors were being paid in cash, and there were even pictures of them, throwing the bundles back and forth as if they were having a football game. companies like Halliburton had billions of dollars that they never did accurately account for. I think partly because at the same time that they were increasing spending on the war, they were reducing spending on auditors and contract officers at the Pentagon. And of course, in the middle of a war zone, the military commander's first obligation is not to chase how Halliburton's spending its money, it's to protect his troops and deal with the military strategy and approaches. So certainly a lot of money was lost in that process, which often happens in war zones. There's great opportunities for profiteering. So, again, I don't think the government, set out to do this necessarily, but nor did they take measures that they should have, I think, to try to curb that activity.
Right, so they couldn't afford auditors. Well, yeah, I suppose that would be one reason why you'd lose $8 billion in cash. William Hartung, thanks so much for being on. The book is Profits of War, and thanks so much again for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank my guest, William Hartung. His book is called Profits of War. If you'd like to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.